ceremony to ensure that we're being culturally appropriate with our patients. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the community work that we do with Māori who have Huntington's disease. I will tell you what that is eventually. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our brain plasticity work and what that means and how we are going to be doing that work with Māori communities. Okay, and then I wrote it twice. Okay, so ko wai mātou means who are we? We are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and the tribal basis of all our groupings is 7 waka, 7 canoes that came from sort of a mythical place called Hawaii. And so when I introduced myself, I talked to you about Te Arawa being my waka. So that is the canoe that I come from, and there are a group of tribes that are associated with that canoe, and I have affiliations to all those tribes. We have, when I introduced myself, I told you what my river was, what my mountain was, and where my land is, and this is really important to us. We believe that the land and the water and the mountains are our ancestors, and so we are connected to places not just because we are geographically there, but also because we have a spiritual and a familial kind of connection to those things. And so Māori make up 14.9% of the population in New Zealand, which is roughly about 600,000 people, and we're very lucky. We speak a common language. There are 3 or 4 different dialects, but it's kind of like you change a couple of letters and you can hear. And Taranaki, which is where I do a lot of my research, they speak a funny dialect. And so it's taken me a while to get used to understanding what it is that they say, but I realise that I understand it now. What's very interesting about the Māori population is that it's young. And so the median age is 23.9 years compared to the general population, which is 38 years. So we have a very young population. Further down, we have lots of children. So 21% of our people have more than 4 kids, compared to 12.7% of the general population. So we have a young population, we have lots of babies, and obviously that has effects on our health and the way that we treat health. We find that the European population in New Zealand has a much, much older median age. And the baby boomers, there's lots of, they're a very aging population, whereas our population is quite young. Our median income is significantly less than the general income, and it's still pretty low, so 30,600 is the general, and for us it's 22,500 with more than 4 babies. So, yeah, and we've got a lot of smokers. So I heard there was some evidence that showed that Māori women had the highest rate of smoking in the world, with about 50% of women smoking. According to the census in 2013, which is where I got this data, 32% smoke. But I don't know, that's kind of self-reporting kind of thing. And that's compared to 15% in the general population. So lots of smokers, and not generally highly educated either. So 10% have bachelor's or higher compared to 20% in the general population. And so what happens with our health? Well, similar to other Indigenous peoples around the world, we have much higher rates of diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. And what's very interesting is we are getting these diseases younger. So in some of the stroke cases, we're getting in people who are like 20. Whereas, the average age of stroke is, I think it's in the 70s, late 60s, 70s. And for Māori, we are getting strokes at least 10 years younger, if not more. Obviously with cardiovascular disease, same risk factors for stroke. We have high rates of that, high rates of cancer and high rates of diabetes, because we no longer have a traditional diet. And in fact, in New Zealand, it's a risk factor just to be Māori with all of these diseases. And I think, a lot of us find that a little bit offensive. Yeah. And there are also issues with higher morbidity and mortality. So if you have a stroke, then you tend to stay in hospital longer and are sicker for longer, and you're more likely to die than the non-Māori population. And that is the same with all of those diseases, basically. And so that kind of means greater suffering and higher usage of health services. So how does this connect with you guys? Well, there are 370 million people worldwide who meet the United Nations definition of being Indigenous. And so we are one of, well, we're kind of a tiny little drop in the bucket of that. But obviously we have a lot of the same issues, Indigenous people, and we also believe that that means we're going to have some of the same solutions. And so I work with a lot of Indigenous people around the world to try and find solutions for these things. And so, you know, I started off my career as a scientist studying diabetes, actually, because I really wanted to make a contribution towards some of the morbidity and mortality that was happening amongst Māori in this area. And I worked on drugs to treat diabetic heart disease. But I really love the brain, and I really liked the idea of working on this disease called Huntington's disease. So I started working on Huntington's disease about 12 years ago. And it's a very interesting disease. Okay, no, that's all right. The brain on the left, you can see it's kind of got a round part in the middle with a line through it. That's called the striatum, and that's the part of the brain that's really affected in Huntington's disease. So the brain on the left is normal, and the one on the right has got Huntington's disease, and you can see that that structure isn't really there at all. And it's shrunken down less than 50%. And that's an area of the brain that has outputs to motor areas, but also emotion, and is involved in a lot of thinking and higher order kind of functions. So it means that if you have Huntington's disease, then a lot of these things are affected. So it's dominant, and that means that a child of someone who has Huntington's disease has a 50% chance of getting the disease. It's not that common, so 5 to 10 every 100,000 doesn't kind of seem that common, but we do have quite high rates amongst Māori in New Zealand, and we've kind of, we haven't really done the study to support the evidence, but we think that it's because we have really big families, and basically doctors don't tell us if we can have babies or not. So it occurs, Huntington's disease, in all cultures and in both genders. And it is a genetic defect that is a part of a gene on the chromosome 4, which is really, really long in people with Huntington's disease. So they have what we call a CAG repeat of more than 38, whereas someone like me and you who doesn't have Huntington's disease, in our gene we would have somewhere in the teens, so 13, 14, 15. One of the things about Huntington's disease is it makes people quite sick. So they have very early on in their lives, they have changes in their thinking. So working memory and just kind of doing simple tasks like cooking, we really take for granted that you need a lot of brain processes. And so it means that dysfunction can happen very early on in terms of quality of life. And then later on, people often get motor symptoms where they have uncontrollable movements. And at the moment, there's no cure, and we still don't know the mechanisms of how this disease works. And so for my PhD, my project was to grow human brain cultures, well, to learn about how to grow human brain cultures. We didn't know how to do it. And to then try and study the mechanisms of Huntington's disease and develop drugs in those cells. And so, I mean, this is a kind of a funny slide. It's kind of, you know, that was like 3 years of my PhD. So it was just kind of like, you know, trying all these different ways of seeing how we can grow these cells from human brain tissue. And what had happened was we'd been working with epilepsy patients who have an operation where they cut out part of their brain as a treatment. And they had been giving us their brain tissue so that we could grow it. And so my professor, you know, came up with this bright idea, let's see if we can make these cells be sick like they have Huntington's disease. And they didn't want to be sick. So I kept on putting chemicals on them and they didn't want to die. So then we said, all right, well, you know, we have this really large human brain bank and we regularly have donations from Huntington's families. Let's see if we can grow these cells from human brain tissue. And so this is some cells that I grew, and you basically take a photo every 20 minutes and then you paste together the photos. And so these were the cells that I spent my PhD growing, and I didn't put on the Huntington's ones, but basically the Huntington's ones move slower, they divide less, and they're really sick. Okay, so how does that sit with me? I was given this job to, grow these cells from human brain tissue, but it's kind of a little Frankenstein-like, because I would have this tissue from someone who had died and donated their tissue to our brain bank, and I would, we would get the brains between 6 and 12 hours after they had died, and I'm standing there chopping up this brain tissue thinking, wow, somebody's dead and I've still got these cells in my hand that are alive. And this kind of led to quite a few, I suppose, philosophical ideas and thoughts. And also, as an Indigenous person, as a Māori person, I was uncomfortable with this at some levels. So I was encouraged to start thinking about the brain from a cultural perspective. And I've got this beautiful quote here: tapu, which is our word for sacred and restricted, has to be held in the highest esteem. You see, in people, it's not in the hands, it's in the head, in the crown. In the old days, you could never touch the head. We take it seriously, knowing that it survives. We may put on Pākehā clothes, that's European clothes, and we may eat European food, but deep inside, we are Māori at heart, and tapu will stay with us forever. So it's this idea that even though we kind of live in this Western society now, we still have this idea of tapu, the sacred, and the head is extremely sacred, the brain is extremely sacred, and this idea will be with us forever. So it's not something that you can just sweep under the carpet and say, never mind about that. So I started to do some work in this area, and I worked with elders, and they taught me a lot about the sacred. And about how tapu was kind of like used as a type of social control and law, and there's rules about what you can and you can't do. But for us, the idea of the sacred is that in our creation stories, there is no separation between the physical and spiritual worlds, so it kind of means that everything in the world has a component of the sacred to it. But that kind of means that we also have to pay respect to a lot of things that you might not think about paying respect to. And so these elders taught me that the word for brain, roro, is from the highest realm. And so it was a very sacred idea. And the reason why it's so sacred is that it is the dwelling place of the mind, the spirit, the life force, and spiritual authority. And what was very interesting was that towards the end of my PhD, I travelled a lot around the States and presented my work, and I found out that certainly in Mohawk cosmology, they have this idea that the brain is very sacred as well, because the daughter of the sky woman, when she fell from the sky, she died, and tobacco, which is the most sacred plant, grew from her head. So they had sort of said to me that there was an idea of sacredness here as well, which I found very interesting. So, one of my dear mentors, Professor Michael Walker, he said to me, before you get started on this work, I think that you should probably go and talk to your tribe about it. And so I had to go to my professor and say to him, hi, I've got this project on working on human brain tissue. Do you think we could go visit my tribe and talk to them about it? And thank goodness he was very open to the idea. And so we went, and we visited them. This was 8 years ago, and some of the children at the bottom there, they're at university now, so it's kind of like, it was a long time ago. And they asked us, what are the underlying principles of your research? Is it going to be all right for us to give you the blessing? And we talked to them about how it's about people, and that the work we're doing isn't just like science for science sake. It's about trying to help these communities of people who are really sick, and to try and find wholeness for them and health. And there was a beautiful woman, Gerda, who came along, and she was Māori, and her husband had given his brain to us, and she talked about her experiences as somebody who had gone through the journey of Huntington's disease or supported somebody. And so after much deliberation, the elders of my tribe gave their blessing, but they did give some caveats. So they basically said that that I had a responsibility, the kaitiaki means as a guardian of this tissue, and that it was a gift that these families were giving us, and so I had to really take that responsibility really seriously, and they had emphasised that I needed to be respectful towards that tissue. And one of our processes in disposing of the tissue, when we finish working with it, we actually cremate the tissue when it's finished, and we have ceremonies with the families who've donated afterwards. So they really like that. But they also asked the question, can we do the research in a tikanga Māori way? And tikanga Māori is basically our customary practice. So they wanted to know if there was ways that I could integrate culture into the research that I was doing. And so I said to them, okay, can you tell me what the traditions are in handling brain and human tissue and those kinds of things? And they didn't know them. That's knowledge that my tribe has lost. But they gave me their blessing to ask other tribes and other elders about the sacred and about these kind of customary practices. And so we went through the process of developing these customary practices, which have sort of turned into a respectful scientific practice to acknowledge this idea of the sacred and the spirit being a part of everything. And so actually the woman in the middle, kind of looking blondie, she was someone that everybody who I spoke to about this said, you've got to go talk to her. And she's quite incredible. She's now the general manager of 2 district health boards in New Zealand. And she has been someone who has been a really important part of this work, because she told me a story about this man who had had a lung transplant and everything had gone perfectly with his operation and everything, but he was protecting his lungs. And he was an elderly man and he was a young man, and she went to go and visit him because they said, we don't know what to do, he's going to die and you have to help us. So she went to go visit him and she asked him some questions. She said to him, have you farewelled your old lungs and thanked them for the job that they did for you? And have you welcomed your new lungs? Because there's a concept in our welcoming ceremonies called Waiwai Tapu, which means stranger. And so you have to kind of go through these ceremonies to make the strangers a part of home. And so she was saying to this man, your new lungs are Waiwai Tapu, they're strangers to your body, and you have to make your body welcome the new lungs. And she always kind of says, I don't know why or understand why, but he got well, and they went through those processes, they did those cultural processes, and that was really something that really touched me and made me kind of think, wow, those are the processes that we want to use in our research. And so exactly those processes, which we have some very clear cultural precedents of, is what we did. So I would do ceremonies in the lab when I first got the brain tissue to basically farewell the spirit of the person who had died, and to thank their family for giving us this gift, this priceless gift, to help us do the research, and then to welcome that tissue to have a new purpose, to help people who are sick. And that was, that was really the process that we learned to do. And then what that was really about was acknowledging that there were these sets of relationships, and that sometimes just acknowledging the relationships is enough. And the relationships were about recognizing that, sure, I had this brain tissue that I got to turn into cells to study Huntington's disease with, but that tissue was attached to a person, that was attached to a family, that was attached to a community, and that there needed to be some acknowledgement of those relationships in order for our research to progress in a cultural way. And what was very interesting about that too was that Naida also taught me that, karakia, so the process of praying and doing these cultural kind of processes, they weren't just kind of about this idea of tapu and spirituality, so for God or some other thing, but they were also for me, to comfort me, and for me to kind of feel at ease about doing this work, and to recognise that it didn't have to be something Frankenstein-y, and that through going through this process, it really kind of helped me to connect and to disconnect in different And so we developed this, and it was very interesting, and we asked some questions like, what does treating tissue with respect mean? And then I don't know, I learned this thing actually over here from some American Indian colleagues who, they used to talk about how they treat their pipe like it's their grandmother. And, that was the level of respect that you had to do. And that was an idea that we took with us into the lab to say, okay, well, how about the idea of respect is that you treat this tissue like it's your grandmother's tissue. And if you can do that, then you're going to be as respectful as you possibly can. And so it's kind of been really interesting, and this work in terms of doing these ceremonies in the laboratory sort of like continue to progress and change and morph, and it's actually been something that's been very, very interesting. And I think it's something that we've also taken into the clinic. And this was really just something that happened. It wasn't kind of like we said, oh yeah, we're doing all these ceremonies in the lab, let's take them into the clinic. We just were. So this family here that you see, they're what we call our Taranaki Māori family with Huntington's disease. And they approached Professor Richard Fall, who was my professor for my PhD, who I still work with. And he was giving a talk, and they came up to him afterwards and said, will you come and visit our family? And we were kind of like, okay, that's cool. And so we went to visit them, and we found out that they had a really, really tough time in the health system. So they had genetic testing where they had doctors that just drew their blood, got the test results, and called them on the phone and said, guess what, you've got Huntington's disease, which is not the process that you're supposed to follow. There's a very high risk during the time of diagnosis, so they already have a lot of suicidal tendencies in the Huntington's population. I think they've got a base rate around 12 or 13% of suicide, and at the time of testing it goes up to 20%. So, I mean, and these doctors just calling people up and not following the proper processes. So we've been very lucky that we haven't had any suicides in this community. They also have no specialist care, so they have one lady in their community who, she's had Huntington's disease now for 15 years, which is a very long time, that's sort of getting towards the limit. And she was the first person in the family to get diagnosed, and they told the family, and they said, hey, we've got this disease and it's genetic, and I think that we should talk about it. Obviously nobody wanted to talk about it. And then basically they started dropping like flies. And the GPs didn't know anything. They're from a really small community, so they don't really have any specialist neurologists at their hospital, and they often go through the mental health system as well. So this family is a very large family. There's 16 children in the first generation. Their dad, who had Huntington's disease, was misdiagnosed. He was told that he had Alzheimer's, because there is a type of dementia that happens later on. And then when his daughter got diagnosed with Huntington's, they started to kind of realise that a lot of the mental health issues that were happening in the family were related to Huntington's disease. And there's 5 generations of them, so they have lots of babies. And one of our lovely old ladies who has Huntington's disease, she's a great-great-grandmother, and she's in her 70s, so she's not like she's 90 or anything. And yeah, so there's a lot of them, and they were very scared when we first started talking to them. So really, we just went into this community and we started working with them. We didn't really know what to do. I didn't really know any scientific questions that I wanted to ask of them. We just kind of were like, all right, well, we know that you're sick and we can't really, we can't do anything for you because we don't have any cures. And I was kind of like, and I'm growing these cells in the lab, so I can't even work with you until you're dead, kind of thing. And then, so what did we do? We had this beautiful nurse, Jo Dysart, who I would go in with her into the community every 6 months. We've done it for the last 7 years, just to kind of connect with them, to check up on them, to make sure that they're doing, all right. And she's really sorted them out and helped them get well. And so then, for my postdoc, I ended up developing this project that was really more about ethics and clinical work than it was about science. And so it was about developing a model of partnership between Māori and scientists. Because we kind of thought, these people, they came and asked us to work with them, but I don't know if they knew that we work with human brain tissue. they just kind of thought, wow, you're a scientist and you're Māori, maybe we should work with you. And so we kind of had to go in there and explain to them, this is the work that we do. Do you want to be involved? Don't you want to be involved? What is it that we can do together? What do you want from this? You know, this is what we do. And it was actually a really interesting process about learning about what their hopes and dreams were around this research, and to try and figure out if they wanted the same things that we did. And after 3 years and lots of visits and cup of teas with all the aunties and uncles, and some of the young people too, we realised, yes, we were on the same page. We've been developing this model that actually at the centre of the model is about relationships and respect, and kind of, yeah, that's really what's at the centre of it, respect, and sometimes seeing the differences. And you know, kaupapa Māori is a very well accepted paradigm of research where it's for Māori with Māori by Māori, but I don't have a Māori Huntington's nurse. I don't have a Māori Huntington's neuropsychiatrist. And so, you know, a lot of what we had to do along the way is teach all the clinicians that we work with about our cultural responsibilities and the things that we do when we go into someone's house. And I think they're really incredibly lucky that all the clinicians that I work with have been really open to this idea. And yeah, so we decided that we did want to work together to develop effective treatments. And so we have yearly, what we call hui, so we go home to their marae, which is the meeting house that I showed you, that was mine, but they have one too. And so we go home to their marae and we meet there, and we kind of spend a whole day, sometimes 2 days, talking about what our research is, how they're going, what they want, all those kinds of things. We just kind of talk. It's been quite interesting because I think we've now had 5 of those. And at every single one, they all want to know the same stuff. Like, I'm always like, aren't you getting bored with this? So they want to know what Huntington's is, they want to know, you know, what the treatments are, they want to know, you know, what kind of, what sort of things that we can do to help them. And so we kind of realised that the research that we do with communities is about having short-term and long-term goals. So it's very clear in kaupapa Māori research that research is about doing research that benefits Māori communities. So we say we want to do research that changes the world for Māori. And you know, what does this mean? This means that the work that we have to do has to have direct benefits now. And the problem with science is that often it doesn't. Like, the stuff that I'm studying now, you know, I might be able to develop something in 20 years from it, but I can't really make any promises. And so we kind of realised that our short-term benefit and goals was about developing these clinical practices that were culturally appropriate, that were kind of about making sure we weren't just going into these communities and using them for their data and as our sort of human guinea pigs and then running away. And so, you know, we believe that our ethical obligation is that every one of these communities that we work with, we have to provide some level of clinical care for them. And then obviously the long-term goals is about trying to develop effective treatments. Okay, so what is the state of Huntington's disease treatments? Well, it's been 21 years since the gene was discovered. And I actually work with people who say that they remember getting the phone call, they go, oh my God, we found the gene, kind of thing. So, you know, genes, the product of genes are proteins. And what's very interesting about the Huntington protein, it's huge. And we still don't know what it does. And so there's kind of been all these different, I mean, basically, if you look at a cell and you pick an organelle, one of those organelles, something will go wrong with Huntington's disease. So everything, every year goes wrong. I mean, I've studied some of these things, and yeah, don't know. And I think, yeah, it's a hard disease to study because you think, well, just one gene, surely we can just crack this thing. And so then, what's been very interesting is that the development of Huntington's treatments, like many other diseases, has followed a very linear pathway. So they've developed transgenic models, or you know, in animals or human cell culture models, which is what I was doing, that they then test compounds on. And then, you know, once you get it working in mice or rats, then you try it in humans. And there have been 16 compounds that have gone from the animal stage through to humans, and none of them have worked. So this is kind of a big problem. And, you know, for me, if you think about it, there are no treatments that slow the progression of the disease. And most of the treatments are horrible. So there's some treatments that they use to get rid of the motor problems, but they lead to depression, and it's a disease that already has a very high rate of depression. So, I mean, are you going to take a drug to stop you from moving about that's going to make you feel more depressed? So, I mean, you know, most of the disease treatments are like that. And in terms of the cognitive stuff, there's nothing that they can do. I mean, they try and do a little cognitive behavioural therapy very early on in the disease, but it's not going to stop their brain from dying. And at the end of the day, that's what the Holy Grail is. We're trying to figure out something that can help these people's brains to stop dying, or at least slow down that process so that they get well. So I don't know, about 5 years ago, my friend gave me this book called The Brain That Changes Itself. It's a New York Times bestseller. She was reading it. She's a professor in education. She thought it was pretty cool. And she said, I really like this book, but I don't know if it's real or not. Can you read it? And, you know, like, I don't know, tell me if it's any good. And so she gave me this book, and I read it, and I really fell in love with all of this work. So it was about neuroplasticity. And in particular, there was a chapter 3 about Michael Merzenich work on monkeys, and he did these fascinating experiments, like in the 80s, where he sewed fingers of monkeys together, and he looked at their brain maps, and he basically found that their brain maps changed when their fingers were sewed together, right? Okay, it sounds a little bit drastic, I know, but then what he did was he unsewed their fingers together, and he found that their maps changed again and diverged according to the input from those fingers moving. And so basically he found that, we'd always kind of known that structure and function were related, but I think we didn't realise it was going to go the other way. So we realised the brain was going to change when you changed it, but when you separated the fingers, we kind of, so that was huge. And what they basically found in the successive 10 years was that brain stimulation that can happen through movement and functional stimulation. We're not talking like electrodes or anything. We're talking about, you know, using parts of your body and parts of your brain to stimulate it. If you do it with short duration throughout the day, so quite frequent, with full focus and intensity, large brain changes can take place. And the work that is written about in this book is about the work that he's done with children that have had reading disabilities. So he's helped 5 million children worldwide.
Is this regardless of age?
Regardless of age, yeah. And that's what the huge thing was. You know, like in my undergraduate degree, I was taught that when you turn 18, it's all downhill from there. You know, like your brain's done all it's growing, and now you're just going to get dumber. But I think that you're probably aware that this was always a bit of a weird paradigm, because everyone goes to university and then they get jobs, and you get better at your jobs, and you keep learning throughout your life. So this idea is called brain plasticity, and it's kind of, you know, the idea once was that the brain was hardwired and it was never going to change, and we now know that this is not true, it's soft-wired, and that when we change the inputs that happen in the brain, our brains change. And Hebb's laws, like from, you know, a century ago, was that neurons that wire together fire together. So this idea that if you can make a group of neurons fire together through functional inputs, then you can strengthen a pathway and build new pathways. And this is kind of, you know, neuroplasticity is basically about making new connections from putting lots of input in a certain pathway, and at the same time you prune off the connections that don't get used. So the whole idea of use it or lose it is very much true in neuroplasticity. And for me, what's the most fascinating thing about this work is that with drugs, and I'm not anti-drugs, I used to make drugs for a living, that was what I did. But with this, it's about specificity. So with current drugs, Like say if you take a SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what basically happens is it stops neurochemical from being reuptake and recycled, and it means that there's a whole lot of serotonin that crosses over, and that's the happy drug that makes you happy, and that's why that's like a treatment for depression. But the thing is that in your brain, not every single part of your brain is going to need serotonin. It's just certain parts of your system, of your limbic system, that is going to need serotonin. So we don't know what happens, like in what ways are we damaging the brain when we just turn on these mechanisms in every single part of it. And so the wonderful promise of brain plasticity is that if you engage the brain functionally, and you have to do it for a long time before the machinery gets corrected, you can make the brain produce its own pharmaceuticals. And, so Sophia Vinogradov, who's from here, she did a really great study where she showed that BF, which is brain derived neurotrophic factor, it's really involved in neuroplasticity, gets increased enough in your brain that it changes the levels in your blood. So, that's a lot. And there's also a lot of evidence that when you do attention training, you stimulate acetylcholine, which is a really, really important chemical that primes your brain to get ready to change. So, and there's lots of evidence of long-lasting structural and functional changes. So the IMPACT study has probably the longest longitudinal study where they followed people after brain training. 10 years later, these old people who were kind of starting to get a little bit, cognitively impaired, who trained, I think it was only for 10 or 12 hours, it wasn't that much. After 10 years, they still are having really great effects. And what's really cool about brain plasticity is that you train in cognitive domains, but they cross over into a lot of the psychiatric and brain domains. Yeah, so, and there's evidence that the grey matter and the white matter changes in the brain, and that's long-term. Right, so I think the next one is, right, so I was just going to show you quickly what the exercises are like, because to me this is the most exciting part, right? Okay. So, and that's the other thing is, when I was making drugs, I couldn't test them myself, could I? That's just completely unethical. But we have our whole team brain training. And it was actually Mike's idea. He tries to get his whole family to brain train. They're not really into it. They're kind of like, yeah, not so much. But I've actually really, really enjoyed it. And, so it's supposed to be half an hour, 5 times a week. Although I'm the worst patient ever, like I'm not, some weeks I train a lot and another week I don't. But what it's about is doing the consistent training so that the brain changes can continue to happen. Okay, so I think that this one here is the target tracker. Oh yeah, so this is about attention and your visual pathways. So there's 4 balls and you're going to follow them around. Oh man, I've lost them already. I know, I think we're on a really hard one. And then you have to, and then this one? No, it was the other one. And so you keep training, and basically what will happen is when you get better, like when you can follow them around, it will go up to 5 objects and then 6 objects and then 7 objects. It's quite hard. And then, so that's one. Freeze frame's quite a good one, I think. So, and you have to do this for half an hour, and there's like 1,000 things. So this one's really quite interesting. This one's about impulse control. So when I see that picture, I don't press the button. But every other time I press it. And I tell you what, when I first started, I was so keen. I was always pressing the button at the wrong time. And then it gets faster and faster and faster. So the better that you are at it. Oh, yeah. See, so that wasn't it. That wasn't it either. Oh, that was it. And it seems kind of, but it does get really fast. See, because we've been good at it. And it gets so fast that you actually can't see, you can't actually see, you don't see that much. And so it's kind of like this subconscious thing that goes on. But Yeah, and I'm trying to see, there's one that is really hard that I find, mind bender is pretty hard too. Mind bender is about having mental flexibility. So if you look at this, if it's a spade, ace is high. And if it's clubs, what is it? Clubs, choose lower card. Okay, so basically, I'll show you, it's quite hard. I'll be terrible at this, don't judge me. So is it the higher or the lower card? It's the lower card. And then higher card. Lower. Lower. Higher. And you have to kind of higher. And you just have to keep doing that for ages. And see, I'm terrible. And you do that for ages, and they have a lot of different rules that you have to do. So the one that I find really, really hard is they have this paper, scissors, rock, right? You're kind of like, everybody knows how to play paper, scissors, rock. But if it's the real picture, you have to go the loser, and if it's fingers, you have to go the winner. And it's hard. But usually what happens is it's really hard for a long time, so it's hard, while you're training for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden you start getting it. And I know it's kind of weird because it's just like these real games, but mental flexibility is a really important part of depression and working memory, and there's a lot of things in the diseases that we treat doing these little exercises really helps. And so the work that has been done by Brain Plasticity Institute, not by me personally, schizophrenia, and a lot of that comes out of UCSF, mild cognitive impairment, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, concussion, hemi-neglect. And so my question was like, can we use this for Huntington's disease? Is it not going to go? Right, we're almost there, sorry. And so just quickly, I approached Mike and he was very, very keen to do this work, and we are doing this work in a cultural context. So I've got a grant through, it's like the New Zealand equivalent of the NIH, but it's through what the equivalent of your, who are the people that Johnny works for, it's like health disparities, and, yeah, so with them. And so we are only working with Māori Huntington's participants who are pre-symptomatic or healthy, and the pre-symptomatic patients we are trying to enrol either their cousins or their brother and sisters as the healthy participants, so that controls for genetics and environment. And we are getting them to do 100 hours total training, and basically we have an immediate and a delayed group, which is about making sure that everybody gets the treatment. So we're not withholding treatment from anyone. So we start off, someone gets the treatment and someone gets the placebo, and then the people who got the placebo before become the treatment group. And then basically we train in attention, language, visual reception, cognition, sensory motor training of hand and voice, and social cognition. And then we'll be taking a whole lot of measurements, and basically it's like MRI and a whole lot of neuropsychological assessments, plus BDF, which is going to tell us if neuroplasticity is going up and down. And that is all I've got to say yet. I mean, we don't start until February. At the moment we're recruiting, and I'm still building the program. So, yeah. So what are the take-home messages? Well, I think that what this talk was really about was that, for our research group, we want to be integrating our clinical excellence. So we work with the best of the best Huntington specialists, cutting edge science. So we want to do great science that's just the best of the best as well, and that we want to do this in a culturally responsive way, and that that we never want to compromise any of those things. So they're all equally important. And I think sometimes there's a danger of putting the science or the clinical work first. So we're trying to make all of it important. It's also been really important for us that we use writing methods. So that we continue to work with elders in areas of traditional knowledge that we recognise in some of the methods that we're building. So we're trying to develop, Māori methods for scanning and for the neuropsychological testing, which is really great. And we believe that that will, change our outcomes as well. And that for Indigenous people, spirituality and ethics and community is really, really important. It's an important part of the research piece that can often be ignored. And, it's something that we try to honour in lots of different ways in our research. So, I was sure that I had an acknowledgement slide. And the acknowledgements was just basically my research team in New Zealand, which is Professor Richard Fall, Lillian Tippett, my clinical team, Joe Dysart and Greg Vanuken, Professor Michael Mesnick, and a team at Neuroplasticity Institute. Yeah, that's me.
Questions for Melanie, I really enjoyed your talk. I come from an anthropological background, so this really spoke to me in a lot of ways. And I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more about if you were able to standardize any of the ethical practices within the clinic, like maybe having anthropologists on site, or if you had some people that could serve as some of like cultural interpreters when people were getting the diagnosis, and kind of if that was able to shift over time since you were all able to draw attention to it a little bit more.
Yeah, well, this is what we're hoping to do in the future. Mm-hmm. So, the work that we've been doing in the science context is pretty well accepted now, and I've written a few papers on it, though I need to write some more. Our clinical work, we haven't really written much about it, and at the moment we are needing to kind of continue to push the boundaries. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're trying to do in this project is we're trying to work with some young Māori doctors who are interested in neurology or psychiatry to help them to push the boundaries. Because for me, I'm not a clinician, I'm a scientist, so it's easy for me to push the boundaries in the laboratory because that's kind of my place. Mm-hmm. But I don't kind of feel like I am at liberty to be able to do that in the clinic. I basically work with elders, and we have this beautiful elder. She's 82. She got her PhD when she was 72, and she's just awesome. And studied genetics and working with Māori communities who had clubfoot. And she's pretty awesome because we work a lot with her and other elders to kind of try and work in that space that is kind of a little bit clinical, but also really Indigenous. And so she's really helping us to push the boundaries. But we think the first place that we're starting from this research project is that we are having yearly retreats where the only purpose of our retreat is to go and learn about culture. And it's kind of going to be really weird because, some of the people that we work with are incredibly busy. But we're saying, we think culture is this important, we're going to go away and we still haven't really shaped what those are going to look like. So we have some advisory boards. So we have a TCUN advisory board of elders who are going to sort of tell us what they think that should be. So I don't know if that's helped you, but I would love to work with some anthropologists. I don't know where to find them. That's all right.
Hi, the last bullet point in your last slide raised a question to me, which was, do you think that there are generalizable principles based on the work that you've done that allow scientists and clinicians to more effectively partner with Indigenous populations in research? Or do you think that it's highly specific to each group or some combination? And could you articulate what you think those are?
Yes, I know exactly what you're saying. So both are true, and I know that sounds a bit crazy. But in this model that we've been developing, we've kind of realised that the most important principle is actually respect. Mm-hmm. So, if I can respect that you're different from me, and if I can kind of figure out those ways, and instead of kind of being really annoyed figure out, okay, so I'm different from you, I don't have to understand why I'm different, but I do have to understand, so for us, if you go into someone's house, you have to take your shoes off, because it's just, and, in other cultures, so for instance, I spend a lot of time with Blackfeet people, so I've got a friend who's Blackfeet. And the first time they took me into that community, they told my friend, who luckily knew Māori really well, she said, Melanie, it's offensive to show your feet in Blackfeet culture. And I was like, oh, great. Because in my culture, I've got to take my shoes off. What am I going to do? You know? And I was kind of, and so the solution was, you get a pair of socks. And you put the socks on when you go in the house. And that means that I can honour my culture by not wearing shoes in their house, but I can also honour their culture by not showing my feet. So then there's another community called Suquamish, who's Pacific Northwest, and I spent a lot of time in their community, and I went to go see them, and I was kind of like, can I show my feet? and they were kind of like, yeah, you know, kind of thing, you know. And so I think it is about kind of recognising that there are some things that you can generalise, but there are a lot of things that you can't generalise. And one of the things that is really important if you are working with Indigenous people is that you have an insider that you work with, who is someone from that culture, who is, you know, open to the research that you're doing, who has the sort of authority that can say to you, don't do that, and this is why. And a lot of the issues that come up around the cross-cultural research, particularly in the sciences, is around the not recognising the importance of a lot of those cultural protocols. And so just kind of thinking, oh, it's only my feet. But, you know, I have no idea why it's incredibly offensive in Blackfeet culture to show your feet, but yeah. And I think a lot of the times too is it's about being observant. So I work with this nurse, and she is our main conduit with the community. She's not Māori, she's actually an English lady. But you know what? She's worked with a lot of multicultural communities. She's learned to be observant. And we went into this meeting one day that we were having with a Māori health organisation. And I realised halfway through the meeting that nobody had their shoes on. So I took mine off. And she got really annoyed with me because I didn't tell her to take hers off. And I said to her, I thought it was all right because you're a white lady, but I'm Māori. Like, do you know? And so she had just said to me, yes, but I noticed and I should have had mine off too. And so a lot of what my job is as the insider in this research, and we have a lot of insiders at our team, so, you know, for me the rule is I want at least half of my team to be Māori. And I tell all of the white clinicians that I work with, you guys better be prepared to be teaching young Māori how to do your job, because you don't have a job on our team for the rest of your life. Your job is to teach a young Māori person how to do your job. And so what was I saying? Yeah, so a lot of it is actually about being observant and also kind of recognising. But sometimes as an observer, as an insider, I forget. So I take people places and I think, I try and tell them everything that they need to know, but I don't necessarily always prepare them right. And so it can be a little bit of a, and yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, and I think, I know that there is a really amazing flyer that has been put out. I know the National Congress of American Indians have a really, really great thing that's called Walk Softly, something Walk Softly, Think Carefully, Walk Softly, or something like that. That is a lot about doing research with American Indian communities. And they did quite a large project about genetic work and science work where they actually have a resource centre online that is mainly about scientific work, but all the principles are still the same. And the work that they've been doing has really been quite wonderful in terms of trying to prepare researchers to work with communities and to do that in an appropriate way. Yeah.
So listening to your talk, I was wondering, you know, in translational science, people are going through from this thing from bench to bedside or bedside to bench, and yours is sort of seemed like community to bench. So I was wondering, how much do you think that your community engagement and at least your involvement, your willingness to actually offer something to this community change your actual research interest and research questions? Because I feel like the last part you talked about the neuroplasticity, and now that you're interested in actually, you know, using members in that community is sort of something that is more, could be of more immediate help to them than the Huntington's research we were doing before. I was wondering if that came as a direct influence from the community because of you wanting to offer something. And then the second question I had, I think you just answered, was how, you know, in the end, do you basically have to train more insiders to go into these communities? Like, because at some level, it's just, it would be really impossible for outsiders to do this type of research in specific populations.
Yes. So the answer to your first part was, yes, definitely working with community changes the way you think about research. And I mean, I've been very blessed that I was part of a research centre in New Zealand called Huntington, and I really only became part of that research centre because one of my mentors was the director, and then I went into my postdoc with the other directors, so the co-directors. And I remember they got awarded a Centre of Research Excellence, which was like $10 million. They gave 6 away, and it was a big deal that Māori got one. And I remember being in the room when they did it, and Linda got up and she was kind of like, we did this because we want to change the world for Māori through research. And I remember kind of being there and just thinking, oh no, I'm with them. You know, like having this kind of like, I'm with the dreamers over there kind of thing, you know. And I was really embarrassed by them having these dreams. And then I worked with them and I kind of realised that was an important dream to have. That it was important that we do research that has immediate benefits for the community in Māori. Otherwise, all of those health statistics that I showed you guys at the beginning are never going to change. They're just never going to change. And so, you know, I could spend my life doing research that's science for science sake, but if it's not going to make any difference in my community, what is the point? And I think that is the challenge that we try to put out to our young Māori researchers. How do you do research that benefits your people, that is relevant, that's going to make some changes now? And that was a challenge that was put out to me when I was an undergraduate. How do you change the world for Māori using research? And, you know, obviously at the beginning of my career, that really felt like it was an impossibility. And I'm by no means anywhere near the middle of my career yet, but now it kind of does make me realise. I think one of the things I never really touched on in the talk is that working with community is really hard. And I have not tried to show you like a rose-coloured glass appear part of it. That, you know, like when you work with community and you're a scientist and you have to continuously be going back into that community. So I think I probably would visit them about once every 6 weeks. It takes time and it takes a lot of energy to kind of, you know, put aside the academic hat and the big talk and the writing and the words to kind of just kind of get down to, you know, I don't know, being a part of the community and learning and talking and connecting. So it has really coloured my research, but it's also been really challenging. And for me, working with the community means that my science and the clinical work that we do goes a lot slower. So, you know, my publication record could probably be a lot better if I didn't have to go and spend 2 or 3 days in this community every 6 weeks. But, you know, at the end of the day, my publication record is not what's going to help benefit the community either. So, I mean, you know, we kind of talk about having an important kaupapa, like an important idea that, you know, gives your life meaning. And, you know, that is the one. It's like, how does my research benefit people is the important one. And so then the second question that you asked was?
It just seemed like what you're saying is that at some, you know, level, I think we recognize this here too, is that you just have to train.
Oh yeah, no, and that is actually one of our most important things. And so for me, I've been a master's PhD. This is my second postdoc, basically, and I've trained probably about 50 young Māori scientists, doctors, like basically through mentoring and tutoring and running programs teaching people how to write academically. I ran a program at Waikato University. We have this really amazing program called the Write program, which stands for Māori and Indigenous. And it was started by Linda, who was one of the co-directors of the Māori Centre for Research Excellence, which is basically about bringing together Māori who are doing their PhDs and just, one, normalising the idea of being Māori and doing a PhD, two, kind of like supporting each other in this sort of social context of, nobody has to do it alone. And then three, kind of building research skills around reading, writing, and all the other kind of academic presenting things that we have to do. And so I finished my job there in April to come here, and we had 70 Māori PhD students who I was having to look after. And like so many diverse different fields, it was kind of hard. But yeah, so I mean, we have a really large emphasis on training the Māori work health forces, what they call it in HRC. And it's my responsibility because somebody trained me. So, like I've had a lot of incredible mentors from around the world, not just Māori mentors, but I've got a Hawaii mentor and a beautiful Choctaw one from here as well. And that's how I met Dottie, because Dottie was her program officer.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I mean, and Dottie just came to New Zealand, so I was like, okay. So I mean, we think it's really important to multiply our successes as what's about for us, because we understand that because of education and our health statistics, if we don't multiply our successes, we're not going to get anywhere.
Terrific. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Well, I think I speak for everyone I say this was a really fabulous talk with a wonderful insight into both Maori people and the exciting work that you're doing to bridge this. And so it's really great, and we wish you great success.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.